Okay, if we could just have a bit of hush, we're going to move on to our next session. Back in the real world and the madness that is the UK housing market, as we've been discussing. There have been many predictions, as you will recall, that house prices would plummet as a result of Brexit or COVID or legislative changes or recession or something. But as we've been discussing, the average home in England currently costs more than 9 times average earnings. The line is still going up. The pandemic, working from home, the appeal of outdoor space, all of these things were predicted to change our attitude to the roof over our heads. But did it? How will consumer behaviour and supply challenges affect the market? This session, what comes after the race for space and are we ready? We'll try to answer some of those key questions for the sector and to provide the evidence. Who better than the Director of Property Science and Innovation at Rightmove? Please welcome Tim Bannister.
Right, hello everyone. It is so great to be here, a real pleasure. I'm Tim, I'm the Director of Property Science Innovation at Rightmove, and what that really means is I get to take the data that's flowing around Rightmove, and that's the supply side information, so that's 200,000 to 300,000 properties added to the site every month, and the demand side information, so that's billions of page views a month. We're one of the top 10 busiest websites in the country. So look at that data and try and pull out insights that are going to help us make decisions and help improve those decisions. So I'm going to talk about that a bit today. In particular, 2.5 years since the start of COVID, and I'm going to focus on the human beings, the demand side of things as much as possible. So what are because it is humans that live in these homes. How do we feel about our homes? How has those feelings changed? How is that manifesting itself in what we search for? And is the supply of those homes in the right place and the right kind of properties? And what can we expect next? So that's what I'm going to try and cover today in the next sort of 30, 40 minutes. So I spoke at Celtic Manor a year ago about what was happening in 2020 and 2021. At the time, we'd faced obviously many, many challenges. So we'd been asked to work from home if we could, and about 50% or so of the country did that. We've been asked to homeschool our children if you had children. We exercised at home. And so with all these elements, our relationship with our home really changed in those 2 years. Obviously, there were also elements like the stamp duty holiday that sort of came in and influenced the market as well. But our reaction from that changing relationship was that we wanted to move if we could, because our requirements, our priorities for home, for sale and for rent had changed. And what we were talking about a year ago was, how many of those changes would stick as we head into a more normal 2022. And obviously, we didn't really get that 2022, did we? We had the emergence of hybrid working. We had the Great Resignation, the change in the labour market, which is sort of ongoing. We had the emergence of inflation, and then the actions taken by the Bank of England to bring inflation back under control. We obviously had the terrible invasion of Ukraine, and we had a sort of more focus on global energy prices than I think I can remember certainly in my lifetime. And we've still got 3 months or more than 3 months of 2022 to go. So many changes, so many challenges that we faced, and we've heaped challenges on top of those challenges. So what has the impact been on the UK market, and what are the major themes that are coming through? So clearly one of the major themes is that prices for property have been going up. So this is year-on-year change in price, and this is the last few years over here, and you can see that in the sales market, which is the darker colour here, and the rental market, the sort of more orangey colour, we've got into plus, double-digit price growth year-on-year. Both those sectors moving up at pace, particularly throughout 2021, and it's continued into 2022. We've seen an incredibly fast market, so properties are coming on and going off as fast as we can remember. 35 days now is the time it takes to find a buyer for a property added to Rightmove, and it's even quicker in the rental market. So we've seen really strong demand, not enough supply, prices going up. I think the session this morning talked a lot about affordability and the cost of living crisis. Lots of different ways of looking at this. This is looking at the proportion of your salary, if you have an average salary, which is about 30 or so thousand pounds at the moment, which I know is it's double, I think, what Claire mentioned earlier on today for her customers, people that they cater for or provide housing for. But the average salary is about £30,000. And if you're looking at a 90% LTV mortgage and you're buying a typical first-time buyer type home, so 0, 1 or 2 bedroom home, you're now spending about 40% if you're on a single income of your take-home income or of your gross income on that mortgage payment, and it's gone up significantly this year. In the case of rents, it's now at about 35%. In both cases, though, it's been growing significantly. So what we're going to try and do today is understand a little bit about what's the impact of some of those themes been on demand. And when I talk about demand, generally speaking, what I'm talking about is the demand we see on Rightmove. So that's, if you're familiar with Rightmove, that's a property advert on Rightmove. Just here's property listing. And there's a sort of teal colored button there, which is that button. And that is when a home hunter is contacting a letting agent, a sales agent, a new homes developer, a build-to-rent developer, to tell them that they want to view that property. They're interested in sort of buying or renting that property. And we view that as a really strong indication of demand. We then look at that, generally speaking, in the context of the supply. So we look at demand or a number of inquirers, individual people sending inquiries per available property. And that's the metric I'm going to talk about a lot today. One of the reasons we look at that is because it seems to be a really strong indicator of where prices might be heading. So this is year-on-year price in the sales market, and that's year-on-year change in that inquirer per property metric. So generally speaking, it leads by about 6 months, 3 to 6 months. It's tightened a little bit. It's gone more towards 3 months now. I think the market's moving so quickly, much more efficient market than it was. But it's a really good indicator of where prices are going. And give you a little view of how that's looked since January 19 on the left-hand side here of the y-axis. The grey bar is lockdown. So this is what demand for property has looked like leading up to the beginning of this year. So you'll see that during lockdown, even before we came out of lockdown, so even before stamp duty changes and so on, people had decided they wanted to move, if they could. People had decided that they wanted to find a new home that met their new requirements. And it was the same in rental as it was in sales. Initially, there was more property around for them to buy or to rent. But as we went through 2021, particularly in the rental market, we have not seen enough stock coming on. It's not replenishing at the rate it needs to as property is being bought or rented. So that's where we end up at the beginning of this year, 2.5 times the level of inquirers per property as we had seen back in January 2019. So phenomenal growth and a phenomenal change in that particular metric. So it's not surprising, I suppose, that we have seen prices move in the way that they have. But today it's all about, well, we're going to try and get under the hood of behaviour. I'm going to try and fill in this behaviour matrix. I'm going to ask a few questions. So one is have people widened their budget? So in response to those themes and those changes, cost of living, for example, have people changed their budgets? Are people looking for those big moves, that race for space? Is that continuing? Have people have what people want from their homes? Has that changed? Because it certainly had changed initially, and has it continued to change? And then who's looking? Have the type of people looking to move, has that changed as well? And once we've answered those questions about the behaviour, I'm going to try and understand, are we supplying homes in the right sort of types of homes in the places that people are most demanding them? And what next for the market should follow on from that? So, firstly, budgets. It's a really tough question to answer. I'm going to look at a couple of different ways of looking at this that perhaps gives us an indication of what's happening. So firstly, we've looked at the price range of people who are inquiring for their next home. So to do this, we looked at, somebody might come onto Rightmove, they might be looking for their next home for about a month. It's extended out as it happens because they're working harder to find their next home because there aren't enough out there for them. But when they send an inquiry, we looked at their lowest inquiry and their highest, so that range. What's that budget range for properties that they think they can afford and are on their shortlist? So if you inquire about a £200,000 property and you also inquire about a £300,000 property, we would, in this particular example, that would be a 50% range. £100,000 property on the £200,000, or £100,000 range on the £200,000 metric. So what does that look like? So here is resale only. So you see, during the course of the last 2.5 years, 3 years, it's gone from 30% up to 40%. And particularly, it's grown, that range has grown since the pandemic. So we are seeing that people are widening their budgets to find the property that they want, certainly in the resale market. In the new build market, not quite as significant a change, and it's lower. People are a bit tighter on their budgets when they're looking at only, this is people who've only inquired about new build properties. So it's a little bit below resale, and it's a bit more targeted. If we now look at the rental market, so the PRS, again, we see a similar pattern to the resale. Budgets have had to widen. Again, I think because of the fact that it's just so hard to find what people really want, they've widened their budgets to find it. And those people that inquire only about BTR, which is a really small number, but there are people who are loyal to BTR and only want to inquire about BTR. It's a growing number, but it's small at the moment. That's also increased significantly, but it sits well below the ranges that you see in the sort of broader market. So the institutional market in both cases seems to be a little bit tighter in terms of budgets, but in most cases we're seeing budgets widen out. A question that might lead on from that is, okay, budgets are widening out, but they're going up or are they going down? So we try to get an understanding of this. So what we're looking at here is if somebody comes onto the site, they inquire about a £200,000 property at the beginning, their first inquiry, and at the end, they're inquiring about £300,000. So during the course of their search, they've decided that actually they're having to increase their budget. Alternatively, you could come on at £300,000, and during the course of your search, you drop down because you may perhaps you find you actually can't really afford that property that you first started out looking for. So the way we've looked at this is as I described, and this shows you the proportion of people that go from low to high. So what you can see is that the proportion of people, it's the majority. So the majority of people, it's about 48%, start low and go high. So they're having to push their budget up as they go through their process. It's 48%, it is the majority because some people, it's about below 40% inquire about, they start high and go low, and about 15% stay at one set level. So the majority of people are starting low and going high, and particularly we've seen that accelerate in the last year or so. And it's a very similar story in the rental market. So budgets are widening, and in general, they're going up as a response to what we've seen in terms of the way the market's moving. So despite the fact that affordability is getting certainly squeezed, and we saw that with those two charts around mortgage and rent as a proportion of income, people are having to actually, if they want the property that they want to move to, are having to increase their budgets and increase that range. So in terms of that behavioural matrix, yes, I think we've got 2 ticks here. People are widening their budgets. But we have a question for you now using Slido, the big risk with any presentation to see whether something like this works. But let's come up. So yeah, the question is it a good sign that people are widening their budgets? The answer choices are no, it's worrying that people are having to stretch their budgets further. And the other answer is yes, it gives us some hope that people are determined to move. They're finding ways to actually to find the property they want in both the sales and the rental market and they're deciding that that's their priority at the moment, despite some of the headwinds that we're all facing. So I'll give a few more moments. Maybe get past 100 response. Right, so I think it's pretty emphatic at the moment that people are concerned about that aspect. So on the one hand, the market's still continuing to move, but I suppose the question is how long can that continue in terms of people pushing and pushing and pushing on their budgets. Right, okay, we'll move on from there. What about those big moves, that race of space? So when I looked at this a year ago, and we've looked at it many times over the last couple of years, what we saw was that initially, when we came out of lockdown, there really was an explosion of people wanting to make those life-changing moves out of the city. That absolutely did happen. We could see it because we can track where people are inquiring from and where they inquired to. So we can see that occurring. And you could see it absolutely, London, all the other major cities, lots of these big moves are happening. What we've looked at here is what percentage of people, of inquiries now, are going over 50 kilometers, what you'd consider sort of potentially a life-changing move to a new area. And that's what it looks like in the new build market. So it's been pretty steady for the last year or so, and it's about 20%. It's a little lower in the resale market, so it's hovering around the sort of 15% mark, and it hasn't really significantly changed. And I suppose what's interesting here as well is it's still very much the minority. So the vast majority of people are staying what you might consider local. In the rental market, things look a little different. It has increased. It's much more seasonal. I think there's student housing in here. There's moving for the start of the school year, so the rental market is pretty seasonal. But you can see generally it's trending up. This is the BTR metric, and that's the PRS. So in both cases, it's moving up. But you do see potentially some of those bigger moves occurring beyond what we're seeing in the sales market. But still, again, it's the minority of people who are making these bigger life-changing moves. So if people, the vast majority of people are still thinking about local, but is local being redefined? So in this case, what we're trying to look at is the area that people are inquiring about. So to give you an idea of how we've done this, so if you've sent 4 inquiries, those are where you've inquired to, and we've taken the max and the min lats and longs, and we've created, doing that, I'll get this going, yeah, an area which is your search. So these areas, like you could consider that this is the area that you would consider your local search area, that you're going to try and find your next home in this area. So has that been changing? So the answer is, yes, it is changing. That's the BTR. Again, quite low from, get my clicker working here. That's new build only. So you see that trending up, both cases trending up in terms of the areas that people are finding comparable. That's the PRS sector. And the biggest of all, in terms of area, is resale. So I think in all cases, we've seen people extending their local searches. So I think it's really interesting that, you know, if you are starting a development and you are thinking about where you're actually going to be marketing, bring people in from, you've found over the last couple of years, people have really flexed where they would consider living because they're looking for different things. And that's still playing out as changes continue to occur. In this particular case, the resale, for example, that's about 40 kilometers squared increase in your search area, which, to put it in context, that's about 2/3 the size of Manhattan. So quite a big change in what people would consider comparable for areas they're looking at. So are still people looking for big moves? I think the jury's out a bit on that. I think it's still the minority, but what's local certainly looks like it's changed. Right, I think part of this is also about that aspect of change and movement is about hybrid working, and we talked about that a moment ago. So I thought we'd ask a quick question on hybrid working. and whether that's here to stay. So if you can read that question on Slido, yes, flexibility is vital for businesses to attract the best people. No, we're going to go back to 5 days a week in the office. So what are people thinking? Right, again, that's pretty emphatic. I've definitely spoken to some people who are trying to get their people back in. But not particularly successfully. Right, so it's here to stay. Hybrid working. So I think that's lending itself to these bigger moves, or certainly this redefinition of local. What's acceptable to people, that travel to the station, for example, maybe not quite as important as it was before because you're only doing it 2 or 3 times a week now, whereas you were doing it 5 days a week. So I think that's a fundamental change in how people are viewing their home environment now. So if we can go back to what people are looking for. Loads of different ways we can look at what people are looking at. Today I've chosen to pull out what we call keyword sort. So if you've used Rightmove, you may or may not know that there's a feature on there where if you've put in your criteria for what you want to find, where you want to find it, you can then put in a word. Like it's a free text, you put in a word like pool, if you want to find a property that's got a pool. And it will then show you in your sort order all properties where the agent or the new homes developer has included that word in the property description. So this is what the top 5 of those keyed in words are, people going in and saying this is what they want from their properties. So that's what it was back in 2018. Again, I think pool was on there, which was a bit sort of, I'm not sure why it was up there. It certainly isn't now, although it was a little bit during the heat wave. It popped back up. But that's what it was in September 2021. That's what it changed to in June 22, and that's what it was in August when I just checked. So a couple of really interesting things, I think, from this is that reaction initially to the pandemic and being cooped up in one's home was that acre, which is spelt in many different ways, was number 1 when you totted it up, did some fuzzy matching. So it had moved to number 1. Acre was again number 1, but acre's now dropped back down. And I think it's really interesting that what's key to people now, and perhaps this is because of this hybrid working, which I think you all believe is here to stay. Garage and annex, again spelt many different ways. Garage and annex are what people really, really want, whether it's like clearing all your stuff out of your home to sort of free up a nook or a cranny where you can put a desk, putting that into the garage, or indeed some people who have changed their garages or an annex into a home office. We know that's really, really popular, and it's shown as it being number 1, number 2 in this list. Again, it's obviously for people who are able or capable of purchasing a property that has that feature. What about the rental market? So a little bit different in the rental market. So that's what it was back in March. Furnish was important to people. And that's how it's changed up to July this year. So you can see pets, number 1 for people. But what's really interesting to me, I mean, obviously people, loads of people. Actually, can I ask, who here got a lockdown pet? If you could raise your hand. Who will admit to it? That's not, I mean, normally it's about 20% when I ask that question. So it's a bit lower in terms of pet lovers in the room. Or maybe you all had them already. But yeah, so pets number 1. But what I think is really interesting with this is bills included. That was down in number 5. But it's jumped up to 3 in May, and it's jumped up to 2 in June, and it has flirted with number 1 as well. So clearly people are concerned, understandably, about the cost of living, and they really are seeking out rental properties where they're a bit more certainty about their outgoings from a bills perspective. So this is really important to them. I mentioned that this was free text, so I thought I'd just quickly show you a couple of the other things that people were asking for. So somebody had asked for a rural location, and I think they were going for a rural location. Somebody wanted a place that, let's have a look, where peat was allowed. And I think that was a pets allowed. And the last one, I still haven't worked out what this one is. I know loop no. So if anybody has any idea how that's a misspelling or what that might be, please come and find me, and because I can't work that one out. Right, so that's keyword sort. This is looking at hard data now, and you probably, I'm now looking at that, and I think you're probably going to struggle to see what those things are on the, can anybody actually read that? Right, I'll tell you what these are the features. If you're a build-to-rent operator and you're advertising on Rightmove, these are the features that you can highlight about your build-to-rent offering. So you've got over here elements like shared workspace and concierge and cafe, and over there you've got a gym. It's all that kind of stuff. So what we try to do is isolate those features and then work out over the last year what feature have people been increasingly inquiring about, if you can isolate in on that feature. And again, having just seen the keyword sorts, now this is just looking at what people are saying is in their property listing, and then what people are actually inquiring about. And it does back up exactly what they've said in the keyword sort. So bills included, by far the biggest ramp up in terms of number of inquiries for properties that offer that feature. Followed closely by that element around space. So that's balcony, that's garden, and Pete allowed gets up there as well. So yeah, it absolutely matches what they're saying in terms of their keyword sort, but that's hard data in terms of actually inquiring about properties. Interestingly, very few properties actually offer bills included. I think there's some, lots of reasons why that might be the case, but it's really the minority. But it is what people want. So, another way that this sort of concern about the cost of living manifests itself is through green. Now, obviously, lots of people might want green features in their home because they're really trying to sort of help on the journey towards zero carbon. But when we survey people, the main driver for it is around saving money. It's around trying to reduce your bills. And this is the sales market now. So here again, we're looking at keyword sort. And what we're looking at here is the ranking for a couple of key green features. So one was solar. So when we look back in November 2020, so not long ago, solar was around 499, and heat pump wasn't even in the picture. It was way down in the thousands in terms of the list. When I checked in August, solar was now 65, and heat pumps up to 130. So it's not top 5, it's not Pete allowed, but it is really, really important to people, and it's coming up the rankings very, very quickly. So perhaps unsurprising, given the environment we currently are living in. So, have they changed what they're looking for? I think they have. The question mark is still whether that's going to stay. And in fact, we're asking you that question, I think, here. So the question is the increased interest in a home's efficiency a short-term reaction to the cost of living squeeze? So either no, it's a long-term structural shift, or yes, it's going to be more about location, style, space. And we're going to, as soon as the energy prices fall again, we're not going to be so focused on it. That's interesting. So it's a bit more evenly spread than the other questions we've asked today. And I suppose a lot of it will depend on what comes out in terms of policy from government around the move towards zero carbon, where they're going to push on that and how much they're going to push. Great. So if we get back to the presentation, please. Yeah, there we go. So yes, I think people have changed what they're looking for. But I think last on my sort of list there was, have the people who are looking changed? And the way we looked at this was as I mentioned earlier, when we can see the location where somebody inquires about their next home from. And we use the ONS demographic data at full postcode level. So we're using ONS's demographic data, and looking at the distribution of, across their top 8 supergroups of where people are in, and what demographic they're inquiring from. And what we found is that's new build. This is specifically in the new build sector. New build back in 2019, and that's new build now. I was a little surprised actually how little it had changed during this period. In fact, it hasn't really changed at all. So we haven't seen a shift to any one particular demographic in terms of moving and or inquiring about new build properties. It's remained pretty much the same. Again, it's a little different if we look in PRS. So that's what it looked like back in 2019, and that's what it looks like now. So I suppose the one I zeroed in on here was B, and I can tell you that's what the ONS categorise as cosmopolitan. So that's more central city locations where we've seen that represent now a higher proportion of people looking to move. And that, I suppose, chimes with what we're seeing in the rental market at the moment, a lot of demand coming back on stream, not enough property in some of those central city locations. So have the people who are looking changed? Not so much in the sales market, but I think probably a little bit of a change in the rental market. So now we've looked at that behavioural matrix. Just to finish off, I want to look at this question of are we supplying what people want based on those changes, and then think about what we're going to do, where the market's heading next. So with that in mind, this is the balance of supply and demand for new build property. So here we're looking, if you can see across the bottom, on the flats on the left-hand side, houses on the right-hand side, and what's the distribution of supply and the distribution of demand at the moment. So hot off the press, this is August data specifically pulled for this, for today. So in new build, that's what the distribution of properties advertised looks like. And that's what the distribution of demand looks like. So it looks like perhaps over-indexing a little bit on the flat side of things. And it's those, so you can see 1 and 2 bedroom flats over there. And you can see 2 and 3 bedroom houses and 5 bedroom houses. So it's those smaller houses and also some of those bigger ones where we're seeing not enough supply given the demand that's out there. And I suppose the bigger one is the race for space, which is continuing, where people want some of that, some of those larger properties. Still, that's still an area that's of interest to people, and it's the area where there's a big supply and demand imbalance. But lots of people are demanding flats. It's just we haven't had the same sort of supply and demand imbalance there, which is why prices haven't gone up quite as much. In the PRS sector, it's reasonably, I don't know whether it's a similar story. It's certainly a similar story on the 2 and 3 bedroom house perspective. So lots of people demanding that, not much of a provision of that. And I think interesting, we'll see it perhaps on the next slide as well, but initially, if you looked at on the rental side, 0 and 1 bedroom properties, they certainly were not in demand initially in that period of the lockdown in 2020 and in early parts of 2021. But we've seen a move back to those type of properties in the rental market, and we can see that demonstrated here. And if we look at it from the BTR perspective only, you can see that studio flats, there aren't many of them at the moment in the BTR market, but that's what people are looking for. And again, I think that's probably a reaction to the moving back into cities, but also the cost of living situation that we're facing at the moment. You know, some of those smaller, potentially more efficient, cheaper to run, cheaper to rent properties are the ones where people are wanting them, and there aren't enough of them around. So that's what's being provided. What about where? So back to our metric of inquirers per property. Here we're looking at the sales market, and that's what the country looks like at the moment. So the yellower the colour, the lower the metric of demand for property. The more red, the higher. This is at local authority level. So you can see, yellow, to be honest, it's all pretty high. because you saw that earlier on. I showed you 2.5 times where we were back in January 19, so it's all high. It's just a question of how high. And you can see it's still some of those areas, sort of some of those rural areas, some of those areas down in the southwest. Obviously, you can see Scotland, very large local authorities, and some of those sort of central areas as well. And what we did here was we then plotted on this chart, on this map, the large new build developments currently advertised, so more than 10 listings on Rightmove, to see how that sort of mapped up to where the high levels of demand was per property. And that's what it looked like. So I think in general, when I first saw this, I thought, actually, it's not too bad in terms of targeting some of those areas where there seems to be not enough property and lots of demand. But there's certainly some areas that seem a bit underserved. I think if you, I suppose I was looking down in South Wales there, Newport, Cardiff seems to be quite well served, but if you move a little bit further east, Newport really, really strong in terms of demand for property. Not many large developments there at the moment. I know if you're looking at East Anglia, for example, similar story with Norwich and its surrounding areas. Now, obviously, one can't click one's fingers, and there are lots of reasons, and I'm sure there was a lot of talk about planning earlier today. But when you look at this from a demand per property perspective, where one might be, should be focusing on relaxing issues or meeting demand from people, in some cases, it looks like perhaps more can be done. On the rental side, we looked at this from a BTR, built-to-rent perspective, and that's what it looks like. So I should say that the scale is different on this. So in general, rental demand for property at the moment is way higher than sales. But you can see build-to-rent, I think was mentioned earlier, it's still like a really, it's still in the early stages of build-to-rent. It's growing quickly, and it's growing in very specific places. So you can see London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and so on. But they certainly look like perhaps there are opportunities elsewhere. Now, I know one needs to put other sort of lenses on this, including affordability, including average prices in terms of getting an idea of what kind of local authorities should be doing and where one should be building and how one should be marketing. But you can start to see that perhaps things aren't quite optimized at the moment. This was just zeroing in on the sort of South Wales there. See Bristol, obviously has been a hot spot, and that's been the case for a little while now. But high levels of demand for rental properties just across the bridge there, and currently not much in terms of an offering. So what next? So the way I'm going to approach what next is, again, through demand for property. And I thought I'd show you this, which is the demand for property back in May 2020. So where was it? Where was the demand sort of picking up? So in May, it was already up 14% year on year. So that was this element of people already, even before stamp duty and all those kind of changes, people were already saying they wanted to move. And it looks like it was sort of getting hotter around the coastal regions and the rural regions. Not so much in London. This is what it looked like by June in 2020. So it just had really, things had ramped up very, very quickly. And again, you can see it is those rural and those coastal locations, London lagging a little. And in terms of that lag, so 3 to 6 months, as I mentioned, by September 2020, we had started to see it come through pretty strongly in terms of price, and you can see where it was coming through in terms of price as well. Again, coastal, rural areas, less so in London. So it was plus 5% by September 2020. We fast forward to January this year. Yep. So we're now up 84% year on year. So against quite tough comparables, it's up. Demand for property is still up. And by May this year, that's why we started to see double-digit price increases. Again, you can see where the heat of the price increases were based on what you're seeing from the demand for property some months prior to that. But how is this, if we roll this forward, what's it look like? So we have seen things start to ease. So demand for property down 12% to 12% up in April. It was plus 6% in May. And again, you can see where the heat's coming out in terms of growth this is. So growth, it was those areas, the coastal areas that have gone so strong. That's where the heat was coming out a little. In June, it was minus 1%. But you still saw prices at plus 10%, as I say, in June. But that has eased. So now up 9% in July, and the latest number, August, plus 8%. So I think we're seeing that absolute, what I suppose we've been talking about for a little while, which is demand for property could not really have continued at that level. And it has started to ease. Demand's come off a little bit, but it's mainly stock starting to come on, taking a little bit of that pressure off in some areas, and resulting in some of these prices starting to, growth-wise, starting to soften a little. And that's what it looks like for August demand for property. So we're up down 13%. Right, yes. So just to finish off, there we go. It should all be bore in mind that that's what it's looking like at the moment. It's easing, but it's easing from an incredibly high level. So this is compared to the 5-year average leading up to pre-pandemic. So we're still 87% above where we were in that period in terms of demand for property. So still very, very high. And when we look at that in terms of that graph I showed you at the very beginning, and then show you what's happened this year, rental still on the up in terms of demand for property. Sales is down. It's coming down, but it's still 80 to 90% above where it was back in January 19. So I did have a Slido question. I don't know if I have no time for the Slido question, but the Slido question was going to get your take on where things were going to go. But I'll go on to the summary. So yeah, the demand to move, as you can see from some of the stats we've shown, still remains really, really high. But what home movers want and where they're looking for it, that's changed and has continued to change, I think, and will continue to change. More and more challenges are heaped on top of challenges. We're starting to see competition ease a little bit, but it's easing from incredibly high levels. So we're seeing demand for property at very, very high levels, which should mean that it's softening rather than anything other than that. Thank you very much. I'm doing one of the round tables, so please come and have a chat with me there if you want to ask any questions or have a chat. But it's been a real pleasure, and thanks very much for listening.